I can compare that to a psychological approach, and many of you are doing psychology along with sociology. Sociology starts with the self. It starts with you at the centre, as indeed the culture does, and then it tries to study that in ways that it regards as scientific. We sometimes call it rats and stats. It's based on that experience that we all have, that somehow we're the centre of what's going on, that we have a sense of ourself as a unique person who makes choices, and that those choices are what inform what happens in the world. The question then is, how did we all reach this view that we have a unique self, our own unique special self inside us? It seems strange that we all have a very similar set of views and beliefs around key issues. It seems odd that we could have reached those conclusions entirely on our own. In class this week, we talked about the sort of notion of what would have happened if you raised a child, if you tried to raise a child without any human contact. This is a question that tries to sort of discover an unsocialised human nature. We can take that question up in discussions on the discussion boards or on Facebook, but it's a little bit like the old Robinson Crusoe stories, which are a very important myth in our culture, because they talk about the idea of an isolated individual. But isolated individuals never existed. Human beings are always born into families, and that's been true both throughout the 200 or 1,000 years or so of history of human beings on the planet, and it's also true of us as individuals. We're all born into families or some sort of social structure that provides our basic needs in the early years. And so we need to understand ourselves as social beings in a social context, and this turns out to be quite difficult to see. So let me give you a few examples of the sorts of issues where a sociological approach looks different from a psychological one. People doing social work and psychology, will have to deal at some point in their lives, presumably, if not personally, professionally, with the issue of suicide. Now, suicide would appear to be the ultimate individual choice. At some level, you would say, taking your own life, well, that's the ultimate individual choice that you can make. But in sociology, what we find is there are patterns. Emil Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, or regarded as one of the founding fathers of sociology, looked at suicide rates in the city of Paris, where he was living and working. And Paris is a city of students, so large numbers of people come and go from Paris all the time as they enrol in courses and leave from courses to go to work, or they go home for their holidays and so on. But what doesn't change in Paris is the suicide rate. Now, one would have thought that if the population was churning over and changing, that the suicide rate would change with it. But that's not the case. We know that different countries have different suicide rates. So why should the Italians commit suicide less than Australians? And then when Italians move to Australia and become part of Australian culture, their suicide rate declines. The other impact too is gender. Men complete suicide more often than women do. Women attempt more, but men complete more. Now, most people, when thinking of it as an individual choice, would realise that part of the reason that is because the methods one chooses tend to be based on gender. A large number of men choose more violent methods. So if you put a gun to your head, then you're much less likely to come back from that, whereas most women choose some form of drugs as a way of trying to kill themselves, and that gives people more time in order to rescue them. So we get gendered patterns around suicide. So even at that moment, it seems the most, personal choice that you can make to take your own life. We find that there are social patterns around that. We typically hear the media say, people are lazy. It's an individualised solution to the problem. Now, if you were the one unemployed person in a town of 10,000, then I think we might be justified in looking at you psychologically. It might be fair enough to say, well, what is it about this one person who doesn't have a job? But when we look at it as a social pattern, when we say in Australia there's a working population of, say, 5 million people, and 500,000 people are unemployed, about 10%, depending on which statistics you look at. So sociologists say that's not an individual problem. That's not a whole bunch of people who are lazy. There's a broader social pattern going on. We know that at the end of the late 60s, unemployment in Australia was effectively zero, and it is now close to 10, or depending on which age group and so on, but it's something in the region of 10%. The official rates are notoriously low, but let's just take 10% as the number. Now, the argument really, if you used individualised reasons for explaining the behaviours, you have to say that since the late 60s, people as a cohort had got, across the board in the culture, had got lazier or more dependent on welfare or something. And we say that's not a very useful explanation, that the explanation really lies in social class or in the broader economic structures of society, which has seen the global end of the global boom and much lower rates of economic growth, so that full employment was more difficult to achieve. Okay, so we've got a couple of examples now, and on this template you can see the 4 parts of the sociological imagination. We just mentioned class or economics, which impacts on unemployment quite independently of the attitudes, beliefs and abilities of individuals. There are much broader social patterns in operation. And we'll talk more about class and the capitalist economy as we go along, because it's a very neglected topic in any other subject that you'll study. But now we're going to look at race and gender, the other 2 key structures. Class and race and gender are the 3 main ones, but there are others. We could look at disability, we could look at sexuality, age, so a whole range of social factors operate as structures, but we're going to focus on race and class and gender, and I'll continue this comparison between psychology and sociology, because psychology is probably the one you're most familiar with, or it's the one that the dominant culture comes at. So we'll also have to talk a bit about history and about culture. We've already mentioned those in passing, but we'll build on those as we go. Thanks.